Okay, hi everyone. 大家好. Really thrilled you could make it this afternoon. Realize it's such gorgeous weather out there. It's hard to come inside. Maybe we should have done this outside. Luncheon was admiring that we had a seminar going outside in the Watson Center, of course, on such a beautiful day. It makes sense. But anyway, here we are, and really glad that you all are here. This is one of a series of lectures by the China Initiative. The China Initiative, very busy in this season. If you haven't noticed, there's another major China talk this Thursday, Victor Schur, coming from San Diego. And then next week, also a couple of talks. Zach Cooper will speak on the sensitive Taiwan issue. And in this series, we'll have Elizabeth Wishnick. But this is what we're trying to do with this talk is we call this the Project on China's Key Bilateral Relationships. And what we're doing is each semester taking a critical piece of Chinese foreign policy and looking narrowly at that. So this is the first of three talks that we're going to have on that so critical China-Russia relationship. So we're so pleased here. I don't think we could have a better expert on this subject this afternoon than Professor Lan Xinxiang, who came down from Cambridge, where he's serving as a visiting fellow at the Belfer Center at Harvard. But let me, if I can describe his background a little, I think you'll understand why he really is the perfect person to address us on this topic. He is director of the Institute of Security Policy at the China National Institute for SCO, International Exchanges and Judicial Cooperation. He was born in Nanjing, and he's a graduate of Fudan University in Shanghai. If some of you know that very prestigious Chinese university, I've had the pleasure to visit many times. I'm very excited to learn, I didn't know this, but he's a graduate of Johns Hopkins SAIS. I am too. So we both have our masters from Johns Hopkins. He went on and has a PhD from SAIS as well. But for many, many years, he served as a professor at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies in Geneva. And there, I believe, he wrote the book, The Quest for Legitimacy in Chinese Politics. So in addition to being a visiting fellow now at the Belfer Center, he's also senior fellow at the Stimson Center. And I just found out that he held the very prestigious Kissinger Chair at the Library of Congress, which is a very, very interesting place also to observe U.S.-China relations. So we're thrilled to have him as our first speaker in this series, and very anxious to tap his expertise on Europe-China interactions here by asking him some questions about China-Russia relations. I do want to say before we get started, though, although we will be, of course, we're trying to really probe the China-Russia relationship, which is absolutely critical, but Professor Xiang has graciously agreed also to share insights on other issues that might interest you on China as well. Indeed, I think earlier today he gave a lecture on the 20th Party Congress, so he will take questions across the gamut, but let's have some good questions on China-Russia relations as well. But please join me in thanking Professor Xiang for visiting us today.
Thank you, Lyle, and thank you for Watson Institute for inviting me. As Lyle just mentioned, that I have been making rounds lately on Party Congress from Washington, New York, Boston. This is a great change for me. It's a much more interesting topic. That's because I'm a bit tired of explaining Party Congress, which is wildly misunderstood in any case. But we can debate about that. Here, I simply want to stick to the topic here. The topic is Russia and China unlikely brotherhood. That's a title I chose for a very simple reason. That the China-Russian relationship developed this way. I don't believe any historians or even political scientists or international relations experts had expected, let's say, even 10 years ago. It's extremely hard to imagine. When I went to Russia to give speeches, by the way, I'm part of this Putin thing called the Wow Day Club, so I go to Russia quite often, give speeches. I usually start with a joke only Russians understood. I will say, U.S.-China, the Russian-China relationship is the best at the peak today. Then I stop 2 seconds and say, since Catherine the Great. Now, Russians got my joke. That's to say, these two nations, or two countries, they had nothing in common. They hate each other for centuries. They cannot compromise very much on their, not just national interest, but the temperament and almost everything. Somehow they have become the best partner. Okay. By the way, I totally agree with Lyle. In the West, people tend to talk about alliance. That's a total misnomer. There is no alliance. I don't believe there is any chance they become alliance in the military, sense. But they has somehow become the best partner bilaterally for reasons I think I believe not quite explained very well. Okay. I want to mention a couple of things which is familiar things, but I also want to mention a couple of things which is not quite familiar or not much discussed. Why we have reached this level. Okay. Now, historically, or maybe I get my water, sorry. I'm a little bit, sorry. Sorry. All right. First of all, historically, China always had a different view about the Russians or Russian people. You may have heard the Chinese, since the old dynasty period, they call every foreigner, the Europeans, barbarians. But the Russians actually did not even enjoy that title. We know Russians even before we know the British or all the others coming to China after the Opium War. Okay. We had a diplomatic treaty even with Russians, which is very few people remember these days. Okay. We'll talk about, of course, the Treaty of Nishinsky, 1689. That's way before the British tried to impose a Western system on China. Chinese have a different name for Russians for many, many, many centuries. The translation is difficult. I think Chinese understand. It's called Old Hairy Man. That's or Lao Mao's for Chinese language speaker, you'd understand what I'm saying. It's a unique name for the Russians. For several, it's not a nice title for the Russians. They are more than being barbarian, in other words. They are dangerous, they are threatening, because we share borders, okay, for many centuries, especially after Tsarist expansion into the East. China and the Russian or Chinese dynasty had so many fights with the Russians. The Treaty Nishinsky, by the way, is the treaty actually settled the border dispute to begin with. Even though it's not under Westphalian logic at the time. It's a realpolitik logic. Okay. So to put my story short, I don't want to go all the way since 16-something. I simply want to emphasize throughout history, the two countries have very little real affection of each other. And under communism, we actually had a war, right? We're supposed to be communist ally during the 50s and 60s. That's the only war, serious war, aside from the Korean War, it's different. But we had with Russia, it's over the border dispute. Okay. How many border disputes we have? Very few people in the West know, or they don't even care. Okay. Here I want to emphasize why China and the Russian relationship improved so much in the last 20 or so years. This is a very important factor you should keep in mind. That's under Putin, there is a long-dragging process of secret diplomacy between China and Russia over the historical dispute on territories. How many of them? I used to think 7,000, my data shows it's a 7,700, big or small. You think about the long border, everything, over river, over land. But at one meeting, I was at Sochi in the same room with Putin. Putin actually corrected my data. He said 8,000, he said. That's shocking. But, in the West, nobody comments on that. Of course, I'm not. Let me quote what Putin's, complained, of course. Nobody give us Nobel Peace Prize, right? How many left? How many disputes settled? How many left today? 7.5. Okay. Now, that is a great achievement for a bilateral territorial dispute, no matter how you look at it. It is a major contribution to peace for the two powers who could end up many possibilities for them to go to war. Territorial dispute, we all know. Even small one could, trigger some major conflict. So this is one foundation I think has been neglected when they talk about why China and Russia are coming close together. American factor, which I will discuss, of course, is not the only thing. Okay. Yes, American factor or U.S. factor is very, very crucial as well, pushing these two together. That, of course, is for very, very pragmatic geopolitical reasons. For some reason, after Cold War, United States, at least from my perspective or from China perspective, seem to have made the decision to somehow squeeze as much as they can the living space of Russia, at least from a Russian point of view. The NATO enlargement, when the 1998, I believe, at that point, that decision was made, China also panicked, at least for 6 or 8 months. I remember at that time I was invited by one of the advisors who served as a Jiang Zemin's advisor to write something. I believe I wrote something. They said we want to know how NATO enlargement would affecting China. Are they going to move all the way to the East Asian, and what is the trend for the West, for NATO? So at that moment, NATO enlargement already alerted Chinese enormously. Okay. But of course, from the Western point of view, NATO enlargement has nothing to do with the current war in Ukraine. That I think no one in China, I'm talking about not just leaders, but also scholars or elite policymakers, nobody believes that is the case. At least you have to look at history seriously. You have to look at what George Kennan said, which at that time predicted what the Russian behavior might become. So I really have difficulty to understand why that episode of history is being somehow written off. Now, this is another reason Chinese look at the NATO behavior. They certainly begin to worry about the Taiwan side of the story, or the East Asian side, the Pacific side. So the what Chinese policymakers now call salami slicing strategy. In Europe, squeeze Russian space. in Asia, squeeze Chinese space. So this logic also helped pushing them together for very, in my view, it's a geostrategic reasons. It's not even, there is no ideology there. Yeah, no ideology there. So this is the U.S. factor. Now, but the other point I want to emphasize for the U.S. government in recent years is they decide to alienate or make both China and Russia the chief enemy or target. China actually now elevate to be number one at the same time. Now, this is a logic, again, I think it's very difficult for me or for many Chinese policymakers to understand. As Henry Kissinger said many, many times, even during the Cold War, you don't do that. You try to drive some kind of a wedge, right, between Moscow and the Beijing, and it usually worked. The great strategic triangle in the 70s worked wonders, actually. But somehow Americans, U.S. in particular, U.S. government in particular, last two governments seem to decide that they can afford to abandon that strategy. So pitting the U.S., or they try to use what they call democratic alliance to create two bloc politics, basically. That, of course, from a Chinese point of view, China actually had very little room to maneuver. For the war in Ukraine, we can discuss more on the war if you want to, but China hesitated really at the beginning to really support Russia. China, it's unthinkable China will support a new type of a Brezhnev doctrine, which China hated most, is you invading another brotherly country just by, tanks. The Czechoslovakia event, 1968, is the direct trigger of our border war between China and the Soviet Union. It's not because of terrorism, but that's triggered by the Czech invasion at the time. China tried to fight back the Brezhnev doctrine. Somehow they have no maneuvering room. In the end, they have to acquiesce what the Russians have been doing. Okay. It's unfortunate. China put itself in the unfortunate situation, but I do not see there is any chance that situation will change because simply they don't have sufficient room to play. The other side of the story I want to emphasize again is American under Biden administration actually escalate quite quickly, quite steadily of supporting not Taiwan independence, that's exaggeration. It's kind of de facto one China, one Taiwan policy. They are not pursuing two China. They are not pursuing really what they call the one China policy. They are choosing some kind of strategy in between, one China and two China. From Chinese point of view, that's something they will never be able to accept. This is a war-provoking strategy and seem to be escalating steadily, especially since Nancy Pelosi's visit. So all these things, when you put together, you look at the relationship between Moscow and Beijing. Of course, they have to push together. They have to become more and more collaborative on many, many issues. Yeah. I want to emphasize another part of the story here. It's the Russian. China is also watching Russian behavior, the recent actions very, very closely. Battleground is total disappointment, like everybody else. How come the world number 2 military become maybe number 10? I don't know. Chinese military also totally surprised by it. I organized track 2 in the summer. I have PRA generals, I have NATO generals, not American NATO generals, just talking about the battleground situation. Chinese side, Chinese generals are totally frustrated, saying how bad the Russian military. We used to know Russian military better than Western, military authorities, because we had a collaborative relationship between the Russian military and the Chinese. But we used to think the Russians are doing. So battleground is a bad news, but the Russian capability of dealing with the unprecedented sanctions, the measures they took, the Chinese are learning very, very carefully, especially the financial policy central bank. The lady, she is the famous central banker. I think she maybe is one of the best in the world. No matter what you say, morally, her strategy seemed to have worked wonders of defending ruble. Of course, Chinese, we have more cards to play. Supposedly we attack Taiwan, you start the sanctions because of economic power and also economic relations with the West. But still, China are learning a lot from the. That is another factor. They are watching each other very, very closely. Now, the most recent development, unfortunately, is that could create some cracks between the two, is the Putin's reckless talk about nuclear weapons. This is something I think is becoming increasingly difficult for Chinese government to endorse, even in the vague sense. The Chinese have to make some stand on that issue. And Putin understands that. He understands that. Because this is, of course, the nuclear doctrine question. I don't want to elaborate too much, but you know the superpower, the two former superpowers, U.S. and the Soviet Union, they never give up so-called first-use doctrine of the nuclear weapons. They never say we renounce first use. China always say we never going to use first unless you use against me, right? So it's called a no first-use doctrine. But with this Putin's behavior, we are entering a new era, even if he did not use it in the end. Or whether or not Chinese will change that doctrine from so-called proportional deterrence, was what de Gaulle used to call proportional deterrence. Proportional meaning we're only focusing on one or two major cities. Chinese military doctrine against U.S. for strategic weapons, you know, we used to say Los Angeles, Los Angeles, and Los Angeles. We only take out Los Angeles, so you cannot. That's the tolerance level we think Americans cannot tolerate. Therefore, there is a deterrence value, right? That's for second strike, of course. But now the issue is: are we going to abandon no first use altogether? That will transform the entire military doctrine and even force posture for the People's Liberation Army. So it's not something that the Chinese are facing an enormous challenge on that. So this is, I think, it's, the result of this war in Ukraine. Now, will China support Russia militarily? I personally do not see it. Russians really need now are the drones. Chinese drones actually is better than Iranians. It's more accurate. I don't believe Xi Jinping would be willing to sign off a massive shipment of the Chinese AI. Here I want to emphasize the high-tech side, because the Chinese AI seem to be moving extremely, quickly. Pentagon even said maybe in certain area of military usage, the Chinese already surpass that of the United States. Yes, we can, if we want to, supply even more effective drones to take out HIMARS, HIMARS or the other stuff. But China will never do that. I don't believe they will risk that. It's not just alienate the United States. I personally, I believe Xi Jinping gave up on Biden already. If you want to know why, I can explain more. Because Jakarta G20 is coming. Used to be Chinese are far more anxious for summits, because this would be the first physical summit between Xi Jinping and now it's the Biden side saying, let's work out agenda. Chinese seem to say, what's for? Because of the Taiwan issue, because of the escalation of the Taiwan issue. So here I want to say is that the relationship between Moscow and Beijing in the foreseeable future, generally speaking, I will not see any serious cracks coming. If there is cracks coming, there would be no public statement seriously in any way on China's side to criticize Putin, as long as there is no progress on Taiwan negotiations between U.S. and China. These two things are so closely linked now. Here you can see the 20th Party Congress now, the new Politburo makeup. I think Washington Post or some American press exaggerate a little bit. They say basically new Politburo is a war cabinet. Missiles, Taiwan, and espionage. That's the three keywords American press commenting on Chinese new leadership. It's not accurate. But I cannot deny the fact that this is a national security cabinet, almost like a war cabinet or semi-war cabinet, but also they are probably at the stage of expediting the preparation for a potential military conflict over the Taiwan issue. Okay. So at this next couple of years, now remember the Americans have all these deadlines. The Pacific Command, I think Davison, General Davison says 2027 is the deadline Chinese going to attack Taiwan. But I just heard Admiral Gildai in Washington lately. He said, no, Davison probably is more optimistic. 23, 24 is more like, wow. I said, what's the evidence? Where is the evidence? But it is not impossible, though. But I doubt it's going to be planned that way. It could well be, under the circumstances, accidental event, then trigger, then escalate. Yeah. There is no mechanism between U.S. and China, unlike during the Cold War between U.S. and the Soviet Union. There is no escalation management system exists today. The communication is also pretty much cut off between U.S. and China. Now, I mentioned this is, of course, part of my discussion of the U.S. factor. Chinese ambassador in Washington only a few days ago was become news, but I knew that for quite a few. Who was here for a year and a half? The new ambassador who was completely cut off from access, even talking to senior officials. It never happened during the Cold War. Kissinger kept a tunnel open for Dobrynin, Russian ambassador. If there is something want to talk, you don't have to be noticed by the press, right? You go straight to see. Somehow Biden team decided not even allow any serious access. So that is frustrating from a Chinese point of view. They don't talk seriously anymore. When they do talk, they talk consistently past each other. Think about Anchorage, starting with Anchorage, right? Alaska, the first supposedly important conversation, turned out to be a shouting match in the end. And there are several other bilateral talks that yield nothing. I think one problem the Chinese are frustrated when dealing with United States, which is the question of the Biden administration's key concept, that is the democracy versus autocracy is at the core of American national security strategy. Now, when you do great power politics based on ideological issues, I'm not saying ideological issues not important. Human rights, all these issues are important. I also wrote quite a few things in English, of course, mostly criticizing the Chinese policies on variety of issues. But you cannot bet the geopolitical, issues or your national security issues pinned on the ideological questions. The conversation China and the U.S. are having now, in most cases, are the U.S. side, making accusations 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, basically like that. There's nothing practical they're talking about. Now, with Russia, of course, it's a totally different picture. They are, there's not much ideological thing going on. You see, I think I want to conclude by saying there's one misunderstanding in the U.S., in particular, about this relationship, is that they believe Russia and China represent a model that challenge the Western order or Western democracy. That is something I think I cannot believe it's true. Okay, because communist system lost attraction for everywhere in the world. You think the Chinese are still communist? Of course, that you don't know China, right? So nothing I can say. I wrote a book about legitimacy question of China, how to define. Yes, it is still one-party dictatorship. It is still, but how big difference from today's system and the old dynastic system in terms of the policy making and so on. I would say much closer to that than to a typical communist dictatorship. Okay. Besides, because communists have no attraction in the world, the model is no longer valid for influencing other people in the world, not to mention the people in the West. When Khrushchev says, "We will bury you," when had this kitchen debate with Nixon, at that time, actually, there are a lot of echoes, even in the U.S., not to mention the third world, other countries, because you have left-wing movement, you have unions, you have these later the generation, anti-war generation, and the civil rights movement. They're actually sympathetic with that view. Okay. Today, I don't believe any socialist or communist model can really compete with market economic model per se. So Chinese will not abandon the strategy of opening, except, of course, what they're trying to do is so-called or more regulated opening, or Xi Jinping's new concept is called systemic opening, systemic opening project. The real danger for democracy is within. China policy, maybe Russian policy, but I'm just saying this is what the Chinese feeling, or my own feeling. China policy is almost hijacked by your domestic politics. Washington is a town where everybody competes who is more hawkish these days. As president, I never believe I will see this day. Anyone become more and more hawkish as getting a political credit. It's absurd situation. China policy is the only handle in Washington, D.C. that can maintain some kind of facade of bipartisanship. Honestly, I do not see any other serious issue there is a bipartisanship anymore. In Europe, you pitting your national strategy as an autocracy versus democracy may end up with European countries moving the voters to the right, which is already taking place. Italy, I'm afraid Germany as well, in the end, not to mention several other countries. That's a real danger, real challenge to democracy. I love democracy per se, but democracy is not a software you just put on the machine. It works everywhere. You have to re-identify the root cause. Okay, I'm finished already. So this is where I think China-Russian relationship is unlikely brotherhood because they are not based on ideology at all. There is no ideological talk even between them. So therefore, it's not a autocracy versus a democracy challenge. Okay, I stop here. I'm just talking off my head. Thank you. Thank you.
You want to stay at the podium, or you can maybe sit down?
I sit down.
Yeah, relax a little bit.
Sit down.
That's great.
Sorry.
I hope we'll have a lot of great questions from the audience here. Maybe I'll kick things off with one or two, though.
Right.
Lan Xin, I was fascinated by your observation that that China already was kind of worried about NATO in the 90s. I find that quite amazing. But in the last few years, even before the war in Ukraine, NATO was already leaning toward the Asia-Pacific. So is that part of Beijing's calculus these days? Did that have a major impact? You know, we saw the British carrier. And one more question, I can't resist asking about where does Belt and Road stand? You know, I mean, if you look at a map, Russia is a big part of Belt and Road. Sure. How is Belt and Road impacted by the war in Ukraine?
Well, the second question is obviously it was impact, but mainly because we had enormous investment in Ukraine before the war. China did not gain much, you know.
Yeah.
Ukraine is the biggest country, or I think we had the biggest investment in the former Soviet sphere. It's Ukraine and Kazakhstan, you know, and so on. So yes, it's not a happy situation, but it did not yet affecting the transit routes. Remember, we have now the freight, you know, on the rail freight, and the many other routes so far has not been greatly affected. Not yet. But also in Central Asia, Central Asian countries, they are not all supporting the war in Ukraine. So they actually want to invite, remember, Central Asia is our focus in this part of the world for the Belt and Road Initiative.
Yeah.
So China still get more opportunities to invest or to do things, trade with the Central Asian countries. So, well, Africa and many other parts, it's a different story, but they are not quite affected by the war itself. Now, you talk about the NATO members try to show a flag in support of the American Indo-Pacific strategy. I personally do not see Chinese take that too seriously. British in particular. This is a typical British east of Suez, the old dream when the British in such a trouble. I think Chinese understood that. British excessively active in attacking the Hong Kong issue, and the British also claim we are still Far East and, you know, Navy power. It's just a nostalgie. Oh no, sorry, it's French called nostalgic.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter that much. The even Americans don't really take that seriously. Austin humiliated British when they sent the carrier to Asia. Right? I was there listening to Austin in Singapore. British is so shocked that Austin said, basically, go home. you know, one carrier here, you better go back defend, you know, there. I mean, the Russians there. So that's not a big deal. The French, if you want me to give you, the French side story is different because the French really is a Pacific power today. But the French still own quite a few islands in, South Pacific. So the French are actually making a better case, saying we need Charles de Gaulle to be there. But they are not provoking Chinese in that way, because there is always a special link between Paris and Beijing. We talk behind the scenes, as they say. So, Germany, of course, they don't do very much. So it's not big deal. Yeah.
Very good.
Sorry.
Right.
Yes.
How about some questions
Yes.
from the audience?
Yeah,
Yes,
sure.
sir, yes. Go ahead.
Yes.
I have a son who's been working in Shanghai
Oh.
for over a decade.
Well,
And I sort of expressed a concern as a dad in terms of well, you mentioned Germany and Volkswagen having a huge footprint,
right.
manufacturing footprint in mainland China.
Right.
What is the outlook for either cooperation or strategic retreat of, let's say, big global companies like Volkswagen and others? Are they going to stay, or how do you measure that, and what's the outlook?
Well, our outlook actually is not so bad. If you look at what Scholz visit, what he is able to achieve, as a EU strategy, they now says we need to reduce dependency, the level of dependency on China market. That's the official line. Every EU member is supposed to agree. But then each country has their own way of doing their things. For example, Scholz went there. Well, he got 190 Airbus, right? I mean, that's also important for. And he got a breakthrough for the Pfizer, because Chinese for 3 years of the COVID, there is no foreign vaccine there. It's supposed to be a good, giant market, right? So he has done quite a few things. He has the most important CEOs of Germany there, which means they are intent still to expand things. They're going to cut what? They're going to cut high tech, that's for sure. That's part of the transatlantic deal of high tech control. They don't want to transfer the high tech into China for what American demands as security reasons and so on and so forth. So certain area will be cut, but other area may not. Besides, I think the business community are still relatively confident, even with this war cabinet there. They began to realize that Chinese probably is not going to go back, as Wall Street Journal or some other paper say, go back to planned economy. That is over. There is no chance Chinese will go back to planned economy. I don't see it. I don't see it. They're actually starting opening financial sector. They're opening medical hospital sector, and the most impressive is they're opening tourist sector even. I never thought that this happened too fast. That's a huge business, by the way, because Chinese capital monopolize every travel agency in China for, let's say Europeans are so keen on Chinese because the Europeans are always telling me, please, only 1% of Chinese coming to Europe, it will be overwhelm all our facilities, right? So, but there used to be Chinese travel agency are the ones who organize group trips, organize everything. Main part of the profits goes only to Chinese. Now they open only a couple of weeks ago. So many areas are regulated, but they are opening. Probably opening even bigger. The door will be even bigger, in my view. But other area, depends on which sector you're talking about. Yes. Yeah. Sorry.
How do you see the China-Russia relationship developing in Africa?
Personally, I actually have not seen any serious collaboration there, because the Russians are doing totally different things. China do infrastructure mainly, and mining the resources, and also we are doing a lot of agriculture in Africa. 20, 30 years ago, probably no more than 100,000 Chinese in the African continent. Now I was told, I used to run another center called Brotherhood Center. I travel 30% of these countries, which is about 25 countries. So, yes, the Russians only do one or two things. You see, they don't have much. We are not overlapping in many areas. So I do not see there is a serious collaboration. Now, it worries Americans, of course. They think, well, China has a base in Djibouti. Maybe militarily they're going to do some joint stuff. No, I doubt. It's not going to happen. Yeah.
Interesting question. Yeah, sir.
Yeah, I was wondering your thoughts about how
Yeah.
China views Russia's attacking the infrastructure of Ukraine.
Official line the Chinese made is always, we don't like the idea of attacking civilians, attacking infrastructure, utility facilities. The Chinese all repeat all the time on that. But they're not happy, of course, because remember, a lot of infrastructures built by China after Ukraine become independent. Including, yes, some electronic, plants, and so it is a bad situation. But China, at this moment and in the foreseeable future, they will never make it public, naming Russia. They only disagree with Russia in principle, they would say, but they will never naming Russia did this. It's not going to happen unless U.S.-China relationship somehow improve. Yes, sorry. Do we have? Okay.
So this
Sorry.
unlikely brotherhood, you would argue, is based on.
Sorry, can we get you on the mic?
Yeah.
So this unlikely brotherhood, you would argue, is based on U.S.-China relationship and U.S.-Russia relationship, and in an alternative world, what does a different U.S.-China relationship look like?
Well, let's go back to so-called strategic ambiguity. That will be my suggestion. What Biden administration is doing is pursuing what's called strategic clarity. Clarity means you specify what America going to do if there is, conflict, Taiwan military action. Strategic ambiguity actually worked more than 40 years. I personally do not. Chinese understood that logic, and they actually take that logic, strategic ambiguity, as part of the American deterrence. You see, which actually worked. Now, deterrence, two sides, both Taiwan and mainland China. That's what Americans been doing the past 40 years until recently they seem to be abandoning this. So when you're abandoning strategic ambiguity, you have a president who supposedly have a tongue slip. Now your tongue slip, one time fine, twice okay, 4 times, right? That's President Biden says, yes, very affirmatively. We're going to defend Taiwan, meaning U.S. military. That's what understood in Beijing. Say, well, then, of course you have Jake Sullivan walk it back 4 times, but where is the credibility when you have this kind of statement all the time? So they need to seriously discuss what your intention is on Taiwan. Let's put this thing on the table. I must say Chinese policymakers still have some grudging, I know maybe you don't like to hear, grudging admiration of Mr. Trump, even today. However crazy he may be, Trump put his cards on the table. You see, he is not using this very vague language, and Trump is not talking about ideology at all, right? Okay, he ended up because of COVID, he gone crazy. He using Kung Fu flu, this kind of racist attack on China. But otherwise, we can deal. The Chinese elite will say we can deal with Trump. We cannot. We don't know how to deal with Biden. You see that? You understand what I'm trying to say here? Yeah. Okay. Please, yes.
Yeah, Kissinger, I always speak of.
Oh, sorry, let me
Yes,
get the
yes.
microphone.
Can we have a mic?
We want to make sure people online can hear.
Yes, yes.
Henry Kissinger always speak of balance of the power
Yeah.
is essential for
Right.
world peace.
Right.
Now, since the fall of Berlin Wall,
Yes.
there has been only one world power.
Yeah.
So it seems to be intrinsically unstable.
Right.
And so now the Chinese partner with the Russian.
Right.
And you think the system will be more balanced? Maybe paradoxically will be less chance for world war.
Yes. No, that's very good IR theory question, of course. Yes, I think it's a good somebody can restrain any headstrong power. There is a need to restrain China. We recent years we have something called a wolf warrior diplomacy, which for me is absurd. Okay, I'm a leading critic on that. You can still find it, my long interview in Chinese, but of course then translate by the Canadians into English and French. So almost 10-page interview attacking that. But that means Chinese also in recent years become quite headstrong, overestimate, in my view, their own capacity. So you need somebody, to restrain. And in this area, United States actually is necessary, and the Europeans have done even better job in that area. Scholz, you can see Scholz visit this time. The Europeans are playing this game very, very well. Unlike the U.S., I put it very simple way. You talk about human rights, you go to China, you say, what's your problem, so on and so forth. The American approach has always been State Department publish every year a document, name each country, poking everybody in the eye. Is that useful? No, there's no effect. So this is, I think, yes, unipolar world is a fantasy anyway, but American made a mistake, I think. They entertained unipolar fantasy too much. They believe when the Cold War ended, that's all leading to the NATO enlargement, all these decisions. It's a kind of triumphalism. Remember Fukuyama, kind of argument, end of history. Even Fukuyama himself doesn't believe it anymore. Yes, okay.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Sorry.
I'm wondering whether you think that structural changes might affect China-Russia relations in the future. For example,
Yeah.
would Russia worry about, for example, China taking advantage of a weaker Russia as it rises? Thank you.
Well, this has been a thesis almost more than 20 years, especially the Russian nationalists been making that argument. I understand the Russian fear, especially Chinese migration, because there was a major depopulation trend in the far eastern part of Russia. Right? They lost a lot of population, moved to the European side. Then they're facing Heilongjiang province, one province, that's almost 100 million people there. So imagination is that just a small portion of that cross the Amur River that, they're going to colonize. No. I actually listened to Putin personally says that is a fantasy, Chinese. Think about this. Chinese will never be able to do that. Not causing a war with Russia. Why they want to. So is Russia junior partner? That's been American thesis for a long time, but they underestimate one important thing, that not only Russia is still the top military power, one of the, until Ukraine war, we still think it's number 2, right? Military power, fully nuclear, but also Russian economy and Chinese economy basically complementary to each other to the extent more than any other, bilateral trade relationship. Russian sells anything to China Chinese would like to have. Now, two things: resources and the weapon. Because Russian produce bad consumer goods nobody wanted anyway, right? And the China selling consumer goods, manufacturing products. And in Russia has that's also a very big market there. Okay. So it's not that a junior partner as they imagined. Yes.
Let me ask a quick question, if you don't mind. You can give the microphone here, but just, Lanchin, your background is so impressive, and you have an experience that many of us don't have. To be very candid, I don't think any of us have been in the room with Vladimir Putin, whereas you have been in a room, okay, maybe a few people. You've been in the room with Putin many times. So one question I think many of us would ask you is, how do you assess this person as a leader? How does he, many of us are afraid that he could be, becoming irrational, and this is a man who has the finger on the button. A second question is, again, given your incredible experience and knowledge of diplomacy, how do you see the war ending? Easy questions.
No. Up until the war, I usually see him once or twice a year, Vladivostok and Sochi. Now, my basic impression is, to use the word cold-blooded, if it's not too bad. Yes, he is cold-blooded, but an extraordinarily rational person. Sharpness. He can answer any question you raise. I never imagined our leader, Chinese, would even answer a question that way, right? The Chinese like to behave like an emperor, rather than as a political leader. Remember, Chinese elite also have a grudging admiration of Putin, not just the Xi Jinping. Remember, Putin was elected. Don't ever underestimate that fact. Elected. It's not a rigged election. When you think about Putin come to power, he is actually popularly elected. Now, do they manipulate his power, suppress him? Yes, of course. But the Chinese system, where is the election? Because it's not Chatham House, so I stop here. So,
sorry, but
I say it's grudging admiration. That's a reality, including people like me, but also people who work in China. Now, the second question, how the war ended, nobody knows. My sense, I can only say, based on my sense, probably will end faster than many estimate. What I see what Putin trying to do now is that he seems to have triggered a mechanism. Most Russian experts in the U.S. or military experts do not pay too much attention. I don't know if you agree with me. A concept called escalation management strategy, which has been with Russian Joint Chief of Staff for over 30 years. They actually start formulating that strategy since the Afghan war, since their Afghan war. How to manage escalation for the purpose to de-escalate. Okay, that's the concept of chief of staff. Americans, nobody take that seriously because U.S. never had that thing. What you had in the Vietnam War and other war, Afghanistan, you call the surge, which is escalation of war. You don't do escalation of management for the purpose of de-escalate. Meaning de-escalate here means you force the other side, sit down to the table, eventually talk about it. Okay. That's what Putin is heightened this tension so high. I think the several steps we will continue to see. He will reach the highest point of even shoot a couple of weapons, nuclear weapons, not on Ukraine, but somewhere else, maybe Arctic, I don't know, just to heighten that threat. And the bet, the Russian side, the bet is Europe cannot sustain this winter. not just the gas and so on, economically, it's going to be difficult. Look at the Short's visit this time. Okay. One important thing Shorts said is we don't like bloc politics, which is exactly what Americans seem to be doing. Now, as for a German leader to say that, we're not taking sides between China and, U.S., this is not Angela Merkel, this is a Scholz. Okay? Merkel, I understand, but Scholz say that. So it's a European, transatlantic, that's what I'm trying to say. Transatlantic solidarity on Ukraine is going to crack. This is the calculation. May work. I don't know.
On a similar note, how is
Right.
the Western reaction on Russia's war in Ukraine have implications for China and Taiwan? And do you think that's why these projections are now going to be accelerated? Are we just delaying the inevitable?
Sorry, I'm a little. You said, can you just summarize very quickly what's your question? I'm sorry, I did. Yeah.
You're good. So I guess now that Finland and Sweden are planning on joining NATO, what are the implications for China potentially attacking Taiwan in the future?
You mean Ukraine join NATO? You talking about?
No, it's Finland and Sweden.
Oh, Finland, Sweden. No, that's a totally different scenario. Finland, Sweden. If I were Finns, I would do Finland in particular. It's a natural development. But you try to say how that affect the China-Taiwan policy? Mm-hmm. No, Taiwan policy is totally different. It's an island. It's not a giant country like Ukraine, plain. There is no mountain even in Ukraine, right? If there is a war, it would be completely different kind of warfare. Besides, Chinese position has always been this is a continuation of civil war. This is not, even by international law, Taiwan has no legal status in whatever sense. So I would not think the NATO enlargement this time had any impact on Chinese strategic and military planning at all. I do not believe Chinese are very keen on that. They want to avoid military solution as much as they can. But they worry about the U.S. Expediting that trend. Maybe today's Nancy Pelosi, if Blinken goes there, I'm pretty much sure we'll trigger something far more serious. No, I'm just saying. It looks, they believe this is what the U.S. is doing. So
Maybe
yeah.
I can follow up that question
Yeah.
with another point. I mean,
Right.
as I've seen it, NATO and the United States have
Yeah.
demonstrated a lot
Yeah.
of new weaponry and, the use of intelligence, for example, in kind of strategic ways, targeting and so forth. And I wonder, do you think that, I think the conventional wisdom here is that this is kind of a strong deterrence message to China.
You mean the recent exposure of Chinese strategic forces? These bases is what they actually publish it. All the Chinese missile sites base is what you're referring to? No,
I'm referring more toward
Okay.
a kind of sense that, for example, the
Yeah.
HIMARS system.
Right.
Yeah. We've talked. Actually, Asia Pacific specialists know about HIMARS a long time ago
Sure,
because it's
yes,
already
of
talked
course.
about in the
Okay,
in the
yeah.
in the Asia Pacific context.
Sure.
So the question is, do you think China's leaders are kind of sobered by what they've seen, or as you put it, that's an interesting idea. You said that it's an island, so it's totally different.
Yeah, Taiwan already get anti-missile, system. They get 6 battalion. I try to remember how many. They already had the anti-missile system on the island. I do not believe it added that much of the deterrence value as Mr. General Austin tried to say.
Yeah.
He used the term integrate deterrence, has this kind of high-tech platform of this. Don't forget Chinese high-tech also as a countermeasure. Chinese, especially in terms of, for example, HIMARS deadly enemy, of course, is the drones. You don't, you cannot detect drones. I mean, it's especially the concept of what do you call the mass deployment of drones. There was a swarm. Yes. China can easily produce a huge supply of high-tech swarm drones. Now, for the ocean, for let's say Navy side, which Pentagon already recognized the underwater, the what do you call this? An unmanned vehicle, right? These unmanned vehicle which actually can live under there like a little bug, live there for 5 years. With the Chinese had that kind of, I don't know, some kind of batteries. I try to. You're the experts on military things, but well, in any case,
You're right.
they suspect the Chinese already have that technology. You have all these things under the water.
Yeah.
So when the American ships there at any time, they would be able to attack. And also for the reconnaissance, they would know American. It was high precision. So China is not Russia in that sense.
Yeah.
Russian military weapon system, surprisingly, is quite backward, except the long-range missiles and maybe supersonic, that sort of stuff. The other stuff are not great. So it's different. Yeah,
Yeah,
I think it's very different. Yes. Yeah.
Okay, folks, we've covered a lot of ground. If some people need to leave early, we have another 15 or 20 minutes. So I think,
Yeah.
we have an incredible expert here. So please, if you have some questions, don't be afraid. Tee it up,
Yes.
sir.
Do you think the war could be ended just like the Korean War, never stop, but
Personally, if you ask my personal opinion, Korean War ended up with Panmunjom ceasefire agreement, which is good. Ceasefire still is a ceasefire, not peace treaty, but still lasted 65 years, right? Even though they never resolved problem. But I doubt there will be a ceasefire agreement. What I see it, Putin will be satisfied. I may be wrong here. If it's a Kashmir solution, good enough for him. Kashmir means line of control, kind of, because nobody is going to recognize the four sham, referendum. No matter how good relation between China and Russia, I've been telling Russian friends, don't expect Chinese to publicly recognize at the UN. That's like a North Korean Kim actually recognize that's part of Russia. China can never do that. So nobody, including China, will deny the legitimacy of that four republics. Right. I mean, so the best thing to do is line of control. Maybe continued fiction, but no war. Okay. India and Pakistan, Kashmir. Remember, India and Pakistan had several clashes over the Kashmir. Had one serious little war, but on the whole, it holds. I mean, it's not that bad. That's my view. I may be wrong. I may be wrong. I will say both Ukraine and Russia probably end up satisfied. Because Ukraine will continue to assert we don't lose territory. We don't recognize it. So that may be the case.
Can you comment on
Yes.
India? And, there was an article in the New York Times, I don't know if you saw it today, where they said India could be a mediator in the Ukraine war, and that raised the question of China as a mediator. But a deeper question about India is how has the war and India's position on the war somehow improved India's relationship with China, seemingly, because they have something
Quite
in
a
common?
lot, yes, certainly quite a lot. Not just because India's view or India's attitude on this war, but also there is another reason is that the Indian distanced itself from what American call the Indo-Pacific strategy. Remember, that's the only thing Americans seem to have worked out in the more concrete sense. so-called Indo-Pacific strategy. But India, of course, defending its own national interests. You know, saying you see, Indo-Pacific strategy is, for me, it's almost like a ridiculous concept, because Indo-Pacific, the extreme eastern side, western side of the Pacific is the United States. The Indian Ocean side is India. That's the two major players are not a major player even in the region of Indo-Pacific economic activities. They both reject the TPP or CTPP, the CTAP, and several other economic. Then American proposed some framework of economic cooperation. They put up something like 800 million. It's almost like a joke. They gave Ukraine 60 billion. They create a new economics, 800 million or something. It's absurd. So India has no interest seriously jump on that Indo-Pacific strategy. That's the point. That's the reason. More important for improving the relationship. Yeah.
Hi.
Yes.
You mentioned quite a bit about Chinese technical superiority over Russia.
Yeah, okay. You talk about okay.
Military,
never say everything.
technical
Okay, go ahead.
superiority, specifically about drones. And you mentioned, why there would not be a transfer of drones from China to Russia. I'm wondering, do you think the same logic applies to cyber attacks that would be harder to detect? Or do you think that that is something slightly different? And if you do think it's something different, why do you think that we are seeing this abject cybersecurity failure from Russia's side in the Russia-Ukraine war? And why isn't China helping in ways that could be more surreptitious?
Well, but the Russians, but remember on the cyber side, Russians are dealing with Elon Musk. So it's a very different kind of technology. The Russian has no, they couldn't deal with unless they shoot down. I mean, that's. But the Elon Musk project, if you know, Starlink is a project contracted with Pentagon, but it's a private company as well. So Ukrainians, they can use the private company. So Russian cannot do much about the Starlink as far as I can see it. This is something very, very different. Now, say China help. How can China help Russians in the space, or what do we do to help Russia to detect Ukraine targets for Russians to? No, it just doesn't make any sense there. If Huawei going to do that, of course Huawei will lose every contract in the world, not just the U.S. Europe. No, it's not possible for Chinese to help Russia that way. No way. I don't see it. Yeah.
Well,
You agree?
yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't mean in terms of defense. I meant in terms of attacks, which I think can be harder to disguise. It can be easier to disguise.
You mean Russian cyber attack against Ukraine?
Yes.
But remember, the Starlink, it's very useful to detect a lot of things. Now, if you cannot attack a Starlink, it does not work. You can bring down some cyber infrastructure in Ukraine, the older ones, but you cannot touch the new ones they are using. See, militarily, that's what the reality is, as far as I can see. But anyway.
Just for digression, do you think the Ukraine war should be avoided?
Should have been, yes. Could have been, in fact, yes.
So what went wrong?
What went wrong? My understanding.
And are there lessons for the Asia Pacific?
Of course, there are lessons. What went wrong is diplomacy. Yes, that's my view. They could have made a deal over this Minsk II. Basically, it's Minsk II that break down, which means neutrality. Just Ukraine pledged neutrality. What's wrong with neutrality? Switzerland been doing that for 100 years, and nobody attacked. It's a perfect situation for Ukraine to accept that. Zelensky, my understanding is actually is warm to the idea, even shortly before the war started. but he had some hope that the Russian will not do it, actually. You remember, they don't believe American intelligence, the Zelensky people. So it's unfortunate. It is unfortunate, yes.
Can you comment on, sorry, I have about a million questions, so, but please, raise your hands, but I would like to ask questions all the way up till 5:30. But
Okay,
my question, okay,
Oh, sorry.
one second.
Okay, all right.
Quickly, how about the Korean Peninsula and Japan? They, you seem to have an increase of tensions since February. Are they
You mean between whom? You mean between China or
kind of
Russia?
across the board, but with Russia, but also potentially with China? Like a consolidation of, if you will, of bipolarity in the Asia Pacific? Do you think? Does that concern you, or?
Yes, I think certainly concerned. The key here is South Korea, I would say. What South Korea is going to do. The new president certainly moved much closer to a tougher position, try to deal with the North. But I don't see South Korean government can sustain that position for too long, because the Kim is not irrational, but he certainly become a little crazy this year about look at the frequency of his. It could end up with some accident, military, conventional military accident between North and South Korea. So I don't think South Korean leadership will, continue that kind of provocative from North point of view. They will end up try to find some way to talk to the North leaders.
Some
Japan.
have said Kim Jong-un is one of the biggest beneficiary of the Ukraine war.
Yeah, to some extent, yes. He actually sent weapons to Russia, that we know, and he probably even say, let's even send a volunteer. Well, Korean military is not bad. North Korean military actually is very good, and extremely well trained, tough, fighters. I believe Russians say no, because you're not Caucasian-looking people. You have all the Asians going there, just like Chinese asked Russians help during the Korean War in the 50s. Stalin said, no, we can only provide advices. We never go to the front. Because you look at European, so the American will start World War III with us. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. This is more of a question regarding domestic situations in China.
Yes.
So now that the Chinese economy is kind of slowing down because of its COVID policies, the housing market, declining export competitiveness, and the U.S. and its allies trying to transfer the supply chain away from China.
Yes.
So how do you see the government trying to maintain its legitimacy, given that their primary source of legitimacy is undergoing some serious challenges, and that currently the control of domestic political narratives is definitely one of the ways that they're using. But do you see other alternatives? And if there is no alternative, how long do you think it'll last?
You mean alternative form of government? Or
No.
about
Alternatives
policy?
of maintaining its legitimacy. And if there is no alternative, if they keep doing what they're doing currently, how long do you think the strategy is going to last?
Okay, well, I wrote the recent book is about legitimacy. So if you want my view, no, I define legitimacy entirely different from what the Western political science theory about what legitimacy is. Right? I rather go back to Confucian tradition to in the West. I can be very. I don't want to get carried away. In the West, legitimacy is defined by space, basically. That's since the classic Greece, as you know. Democracy, politics actually defined as a polis. It's always defined as a little area. You can measure so polis, then democracy, and so on and so forth. Chinese never had a space concept about politics and legitimacy. That's, what they are doing, it's a time is important. Well, it's not space, but time. It's a dynamic process. Legitimacy defined by actual performance of each government, whoever they are. which government, emperor or man or woman, usually men in Chinese history, but a couple of wonderful women emperors. Now, if you can deliver what you promise, that is legitimacy. Now, you may not be able to deliver 100%, but even 6%, 70%, what you promise, you have no problem. But if you cannot deliver, overthrow the government in China, the form of regime change has always been popular rebellion against government. This is how so-called dynastic changes in China. Confucius is not conservative politician. I'm the one trying to rehabilitate him. He is the first person actually support the idea of legitimating popular rebellion against morally incorrect government. So therefore, from that perspective, you need to define if the current regime in China, in Beijing, have they delivered? Is this morally bankrupt? Or what? Now, before you're doing that, then you can say, what's the alternative? What's the difficulty? Yes, economy, certainly we're running into difficulties. But from double-digit growth to 5 or something, you say that's a major crisis. I would say a little exaggeration to say that's an economic crisis, right? We haven't reached that point yet. Besides, the COVID policy is winding down. Once that happens, the rebound of all the activities will be surprising. So I have not seen one-party system at this moment running its course yet. Okay, that's my argument. Without defending the government, I don't have to defend particular person and so on. I have not seen yet. I have not seen yet.
Yeah.
But in physics, like space and time cannot be dissociated.
Sure, yes. That's what mechanical. That's exactly mechanical. That's why Western political philosophy say divisions of power. You see, power actually can be divided into 3 spaces. That's the I attack a lot in my book of Montesquieu. I blame everything on Montesquieu in the end. It's absurd from Chinese logic. You cannot divide power into 3 compartment spaces. You want to keep a balance? You have to have a government who behave morally correct. Take care of people in general, right? When you have people in the country who split like this way, I'm sorry, I love United States, but I did not believe I have a chance to see this. The country divide right in the middle. I haven't seen that in history since 1860. So there's
Maybe I
something
can
breakdown.
let me ask a related question just to close out the session here. If speaking of moral legitimacy, arguably the Putin regime is facing, a very difficult situation, and I think many Russians and many around the world would posit that the regime is morally bankrupt. So, the question to you is, how does China react if the situation in Moscow becomes much more even tenuous? If the Kremlin is facing a regime-threatening crisis, what does China do? Does it?
I basically say I will say nothing. What can they do? It's nothing. They cannot even help Putin if Putin lost popular support. Remember, Putin was elected with 80%. Okay, he may lost another 20 or maybe even 30% now, but still he is above average compared with any politicians in the world. So I don't know. If that did not happen, unless there is a coup d'etat, that's a different issue here. If there is a serious coup d'etat.
Is this something people in Beijing are talking about in Shanghai or no?
I think they talk about it, but